At first light, a county maintenance worker noticed a parked sedan dusted with frost at the edge of a desert wash, its trunk ajar just enough to disturb the silence, December air holding breath as deputies arrived, notebooks opening, headlights cutting through cold Nevada stillness where something waited to be understood. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on the outskirts of Henderson, Nevada, where subdivisions thinned into scrub and gravel access roads ran parallel to dry channels shaped by years of flash floods. It was December 12, 2000, a Tuesday morning that carried the muted aftertaste of Thanksgiving leftovers and the first hints of Christmas decorations appearing along streets and storefronts. The sedan, a light-colored compact registered in Clark County, had been left overnight where commuters did not pass and where desert cold preserved details longer than expected. The responding deputies noted the position of the vehicle, the orientation of its tires, and the shallow tracks that suggested a cautious arrival rather than a hurried escape. Inside the trunk lay the body of a young woman, later identified as 22-year-old Emily R. Lawson, a community college student and part-time retail worker whose life had been moving toward the holidays with ordinary expectations. Emily Lawson had been reported missing 2 days earlier by her older sister after failing to show for a Sunday shift and not answering calls. The missing person report described winter clothing, a modest paycheck due before Christmas, and a reliable routine that made the absence feel wrong. Flyers had already begun circulating near bus stops and grocery stores, printed in black and white with a recent photograph that showed a calm smile and unremarkable background. When the identification was confirmed through personal effects and fingerprints, the case shifted from a search to a death investigation, triggering protocols that had been refined through years of procedural repetition. The scene was secured, photographed, and mapped. The trunk latch was examined for prints. The car's interior was documented without haste. Evidence bags filled with fibers, a receipt, and a small paper ornament shaped like a star, the kind sold in seasonal aisles. The medical examiner's office took custody later that morning. The autopsy would not be rushed, and early observations were restrained. There were no overt signs of a struggle at the dump site, no weapons present, and no indications of prolonged exposure beyond the expected desert cold. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window based on lividity and body temperature adjusted for overnight conditions. Toxicology samples were collected. Fingernail scrapings were taken. The findings suggested suffocation without blunt trauma, an assessment supported by subtle petechial patterns and the absence of defensive injuries. The cause was not announced publicly at that stage, consistent with department policy intended to protect the integrity of the investigation. Emily's last confirmed movements were reconstructed through receipts, transit records, and witness statements. On Friday evening, December 8, she had left her job at a department store in a Henderson shopping center shortly after closing. A coworker recalled a brief exchange near the parking lot, noting that Emily appeared tired but in good spirits, talking about finishing Christmas shopping over the weekend. Surveillance cameras captured her walking toward her car at 9:14 p.m. The footage did not show anyone approaching her, but the angle was limited. Her debit card was used once more that night at a gas station 2 miles away, a small purchase made at 9:32 p.m. The transaction was consistent with her habits, but the timing placed her away from home later than usual. Detectives canvassed the gas station, obtaining grainy video that showed Emily's car pulling in, idling briefly and pulling out. No clear view of the driver's face was available, and no other vehicles lingered. Cell phone records, still rudimentary by modern standards, indicated a final call placed to voicemail at 10:41 p.m., the origin tower covering a wide area that included residential streets and undeveloped land. There were no further pings. The absence of calls or messages afterward suggested an abrupt interruption rather than a planned disappearance. The investigation expanded methodically. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed in quiet rooms with tape recorders and legal pads. Emily's family described a young woman who balanced school and work, who did not keep secrets, and who had no known enemies. There was a recent breakup with a boyfriend who lived across town, but timelines placed him elsewhere, and his alibi was corroborated by multiple witnesses and time-stamped receipts. The focus shifted to opportunity rather than motive, a necessary pivot when personal conflicts failed to yield traction. The car itself became a focal point. Latent prints lifted from the trunk lid included smudges that could not be immediately identified. A partial palm print near the latch was preserved. Fibers collected from the trunk carpeting were consistent with Emily's clothing, but also included an unfamiliar synthetic blend. Soil samples matched the wash where the car was found, suggesting the vehicle had not been moved after placement. A tire impression nearby was photographed and cast, though the tread pattern was common and offered limited specificity. Local media covered the case with measured language. Headlines referenced a Henderson woman found dead, emphasizing the community impact without speculation. Evening broadcasts mentioned the proximity to the holidays, a time when families expected togetherness rather than loss. Tips began arriving, some earnest, others vague. A report of a suspicious vehicle seen near the wash on Saturday night could not be substantiated. Another caller claimed to have seen Emily arguing with someone at the gas station, but the video did not support the claim. Each lead was logged, assessed, and either pursued or set aside. As December progressed, the case cooled in the public eye but remained active within the department. Detectives reviewed files during the quiet hours when holiday staffing thinned, and the courthouse operated on reduced schedules. Subpoenas were issued for employment records and traffic citations in the area. A review of similar cases across Nevada and neighboring states yielded no clear parallels. The absence of sexual assault indicators complicated profiling assumptions, steering investigators away from serial offender theories and toward a narrower set of possibilities tied to Emily's movements. The first Christmas after Emily's death arrived with muted decorations at her family home. Investigators attended a brief memorial, standing at the back, aware of the boundary between duty and intrusion. The case file grew thicker, its spine labeled with a year that was ending. In January, forensic results returned incrementally. Toxicology was negative for alcohol and common substances. The partial palm print remained unidentified. DNA collected from under Emily's fingernails produced a mixed profile insufficient for a match with the databases available at the time. The fiber analysis did not point to a specific manufacturer. Each result narrowed the field without naming a suspect. Over the following months, detectives revisited the timeline repeatedly, testing assumptions against new information. They re-interviewed the gas station clerk, who remembered a man in a dark jacket paying cash around the same time, though the memory was uncertain and unsupported by video. They examined traffic flow patterns and the likelihood of Emily encountering someone she knew versus a stranger. The absence of forced entry signs on the vehicle suggested compliance at some point, a detail that carried weight in discussions but did not dictate conclusions. By the end of 2001, the case was formally designated a cold case, a classification that reflected resource allocation rather than abandonment. The file was transferred to storage, its contents cataloged and cross-referenced. Emily Lawson's name remained in the system, attached to an unsolved death that lingered in the quiet spaces between active investigations. For the detectives who had worked it, the case did not vanish. It settled, waiting for a development that could withstand scrutiny and time. That development would not arrive quickly. Years passed, marked by changes in technology, personnel, and the city itself. Henderson grew outward, and the wash where the car had been found was partially graded for future development, though the exact spot remained undisturbed by design. In the background, forensic science advanced, databases expanded, and policies evolved. The evidence from December 2000 remained preserved, labeled, and intact, a silent inventory of unanswered questions held in climate-controlled rooms. As the calendar turned and the holidays repeated, Emily's case became a reference point for training and review, cited without flourish. It was the kind of case that demanded patience, the kind that did not yield to pressure or public attention. The story of what happened that Friday night was incomplete, but it was not beyond reach. It required alignment between past and present, between the details recorded under winter lights and the tools that would later give them voice. The reassignment of the Lawson file to the department's cold case unit in late 2004 did not change its contents, but it changed how those contents were read. Detectives with longer memories and fewer daily emergencies approached the evidence with an archivist's patience. They reviewed photographs taken under halogen lights, noting shadows others had ignored. They rechecked chain of custody logs, confirming nothing had been compromised. The case was indexed alongside other unsolved deaths from the turn of the millennium, a period when digital records were incomplete and paper still carried authority. Emily Lawson's name appeared again in internal briefings as an example of a case that resisted shortcuts. Her age, 22, placed her within a demographic that had drawn attention nationally, yet the local facts remained stubbornly specific. Henderson's mix of suburban order and desert margins framed every decision made that December. Investigators began with the premise that resolution would come only by revisiting fundamentals, not by inventing theories. The fundamentals included geography. In 2000, the area east of Horizon Ridge Parkway was sparsely developed, with access roads used by contractors and utility crews. Traffic studies from that period showed minimal overnight flow. Cold case detectives drove the routes again, noting sightlines and distances, calculating how long it would take to move from the gas station to the wash without attracting attention. They consulted retired officers who remembered patrol patterns from that era. One recalled responding to noise complaints near the same wash years earlier, a reminder that the place was known, not hidden. Maps were annotated with handwritten notes, distances measured with vehicle odometers rather than software. This analog approach fit the file. It emphasized that the crime had occurred in a real place with predictable constraints. The car's placement suggested familiarity with the area, or at least confidence that discovery would not be immediate. That confidence became a quiet thread in the analysis. Attention returned to Emily's circle, not to accuse but to contextualize. Employment records showed her working extra hours in November to cover tuition. Pay stubs indicated a modest raise scheduled for January. Interviews from 2000 were reread, their margins filled with annotations questioning assumptions. One friend mentioned a coworker from a previous job who had offered rides months earlier. At the time, the lead went nowhere. Now it was logged again. Detectives traced the coworker, learning he had moved out of state shortly after Emily's death. His move had been attributed to family reasons, supported by documentation. Still, his name joined a growing list of persons of interest, defined broadly as individuals whose timelines intersected with Emily's. None were elevated without corroboration. The discipline of restraint governed each step, shaped by years of seeing cases falter when impatience overruled evidence. Technological change slowly shifted the landscape. By 2008, DNA databases had expanded, and protocols for low-level mixtures improved. The mixed profile recovered from under Emily's fingernails was re-examined using updated methods. Analysts were careful, documenting limitations and avoiding overinterpretation. A partial profile emerged with greater clarity, though still insufficient for a direct match. It was entered into CODIS with appropriate caveats. Months passed without a hit. The result was not disappointment so much as confirmation that the evidence had not been exhausted. Similarly, the partial palm print was rescanned using improved imaging, enhancing ridge detail. It was submitted again, this time to additional state repositories. The process was slow, punctuated by routine reports that stated no identification had been made. Each report was filed, dated, and signed, reinforcing the case's steady pulse. Media interest resurfaced briefly in 2010 after a local newspaper ran a retrospective on unsolved crimes from the previous decade. Emily Lawson's photograph appeared again, unchanged by time. The article avoided speculation, focusing on procedure and the family's enduring absence of answers. Tips followed, as they always did, ranging from earnest recollections to vague suspicions. One caller claimed a former neighbor had bragged about knowing details of the case. Detectives interviewed the neighbor, finding nothing that aligned with the evidence. Another tip suggested a connection to a transient population that moved through the area in winter months. Records showed no overlap. Each tip was closed methodically, the reasons documented. The process was less about hope than about accountability, ensuring that when the case moved forward, it would do so cleanly. A turning point came quietly in 2014, triggered not by a confession, but by a database notification. The partial palm print lifted from the trunk latch returned a tentative association with an individual arrested years later in California for an unrelated offense. The association was not a match, but it narrowed possibilities to a specific ridge pattern class. Detectives requested additional exemplars through formal channels. Months later, prints arrived, accompanied by certified records. Comparison ruled the individual out. The exercise nonetheless demonstrated that the evidence could still speak, even if it spoke to eliminate rather than accuse. That lesson reinforced the unit's commitment to persistence. By 2016, the department partnered with a regional forensic lab to review dormant cases using emerging genetic genealogy techniques. Policies required careful legal review and family notification protocols. Emily Lawson's case qualified due to the preserved DNA and the absence of alternative leads. Analysts extracted a profile suitable for genealogical comparison, adhering to consent-based databases. The work unfolded over many months, mapping distant familial connections that pointed not to Henderson but to a cluster of relatives in northern Nevada. The names were common, the connections attenuated. Still, a pattern emerged suggesting a male lineage with ties to Clark County around 2000. Investigators built family trees on whiteboards, names written in erasable marker, connections tentative until verified. As the holidays approached again, 16 years after Emily's death, detectives briefed prosecutors on the evolving picture. No arrests were imminent, but the framework for identification was forming. Prosecutors emphasized standards of proof and cautioned against premature conclusions. The case required more than a name. It required linkage to time, place, and opportunity. Investigators returned to employment records, DMV files, and utility bills, cross-referencing the emerging family names with Henderson addresses from 2000. One name appeared repeatedly in proximity to Emily's last known locations. He had worked nights, owned a vehicle consistent with the tire impressions, and had a documented reason to be near the gas station that Friday. The man, then in his 30s, had no prior violent record. His presence alone proved nothing, but it warranted closer examination. Surveillance was not an option for a historical case, so detectives relied on records and interviews. They learned the man had moved again, this time to a rural area, living quietly. His employment history showed stability. His neighbors described him as reserved. Detectives requested a voluntary interview through local law enforcement. The interview was conducted professionally, recorded, and devoid of accusation. The man denied involvement and provided an account of his movements in December 2000 that aligned partially with known facts and partially with gaps. He consented to provide a DNA sample. The sample was collected under warrant after legal review, ensuring admissibility. The holidays passed without announcement, the investigation continuing beneath seasonal routines. Laboratory results returned in early January 2017, accompanied by a technical report that avoided interpretation beyond statistical certainty. The DNA provided by the man aligned with the mixed profile recovered from under Emily Lawson's fingernails, not as a sole contributor, but as a significant component consistent with physical contact. The probability calculations, conservative by design, place the likelihood of coincidence beyond reasonable doubt when combined with the genealogical context. Detectives did not move immediately. They requested independent verification from a second laboratory, adhering to policies shaped by past cases where haste undermined credibility. The confirmation arrived weeks later, mirroring the initial findings. The evidence had crossed a threshold, but it still required integration with the broader record to establish a narrative that would withstand scrutiny. Investigators returned to December 2000 with renewed focus, aligning the man's documented movements with Emily's timeline. Employment records showed he had completed a late shift that Friday at a warehouse less than a mile from the gas station. Time clocks placed him leaving at 9:10 p.m., minutes before Emily appeared on surveillance. His vehicle, a light pickup, matched the general class of the tire impression photographed near the wash, though the pattern remained common. Cell phone billing records, sparse but informative, indicated activity consistent with his stated route home, which intersected with the road Emily would have taken. The alignment was circumstantial but coherent. It suggested opportunity without yet establishing intent. The investigation examined whether Emily and the man knew each other. Employment overlap was ruled out, but a review of customer records from the department store revealed his name among frequent shoppers during the holiday season. Witness interviews from 2000 were revisited with care, mindful of memory's limits. One former cashier recalled a quiet man who asked routine questions and lingered near closing time, though she could not place a date with certainty. The recollection was noted, not elevated. The standard remained evidence, not recollection alone. Attention turned to the car. The partial palm print on the trunk latch was compared directly with the man's prints. The match was conclusive. Ridge characteristics aligned in sufficient number and clarity to meet identification standards. The print's location suggested direct contact with the latch, a detail consistent with the trunk having been opened by someone other than Emily. Combined with the DNA and the timeline, the case moved from possibility to probable cause. Detectives prepared an arrest affidavit that laid out the facts in plain language, avoiding narrative flourish. Each claim was footnoted to reports, logs, and laboratory certifications. Prosecutors reviewed the document line by line, requesting clarifications and additional corroboration. The process took months, a deliberate pace that reflected the stakes. In November 2018, a grand jury was convened. Evidence was presented in sequence, beginning with the discovery and moving through the years without commentary on motive beyond what could be inferred lawfully. The genealogical methods were explained with emphasis on consent and legal boundaries. The grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder. An arrest warrant followed. The man was taken into custody at his residence without incident, a quiet morning marked by procedural calm rather than spectacle. News of the arrest reached Henderson as Thanksgiving approached, a timing that echoed the case's origin in the holiday season. Public reaction was restrained. Local coverage emphasized the length of the investigation and the role of advancing science. Emily Lawson's family issued a brief statement acknowledging the work of law enforcement and asking for privacy. The court process unfolded over the next year, shaped by motions challenging the admissibility of genealogical evidence and the age of the case. Each challenge was addressed through hearings that relied on expert testimony and precedent. The court admitted the evidence, finding that collection and analysis complied with constitutional standards and departmental policy. The trial began in early 2020, before the pandemic altered court operations. Proceedings were orderly, with jurors attentive to the methodical presentation. The prosecution focused on linkage rather than character, outlining how independent strands of evidence converged. The defense emphasized the passage of time and the absence of eyewitnesses. The jury weighed the record, guided by instructions that stressed reasonable doubt and the evaluation of forensic evidence. After deliberation, a verdict was returned finding the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing occurred months later, delayed by procedural considerations. The court imposed a term consistent with statutory guidelines, noting the gravity of the offense and the absence of prior violent convictions. There were no speeches that sought closure beyond what the law could provide. The record reflected a conclusion reached through patience rather than confession. Emily Lawson's name was spoken in court, attached finally to an outcome. In the aftermath, the department reviewed the case internally, documenting lessons learned. Evidence preservation was cited as decisive. So was the willingness to revisit assumptions without abandoning standards. The wash where the car had been found was now bordered by development, its quiet altered by progress. Yet the case remained anchored to that December morning, when frost and silence preserved details long enough to be heard years later. For Emily's family, the holidays carried a different weight. The absence remained, but it was no longer compounded by uncertainty. The legal outcome did not restore what was lost, but it affirmed that the record mattered, that careful work across decades could still speak for someone who could not. The case file was closed, labeled with a final disposition. In the archives, it joined others marked solved, a quiet testament to procedure over time, and to a community that waited without spectacle for an answer that arrived, at last, within the law. The conviction did not end the administrative life of the case. Following sentencing, the file entered a post-resolution phase that required as much care as the investigation itself. Detectives prepared a comprehensive closure report, a document intended not for the public, but for the permanent record. It retraced every step from December 2000 through the verdict, noting where evidence had remained dormant and where advances had altered interpretation. The report avoided self-congratulation. Its tone was procedural, reflective of a department culture shaped by long winters of unanswered questions. Supervisors reviewed the document line by line, ensuring accuracy before it was archived alongside trial transcripts and appellate notices. In Henderson, the story settled into the background of local memory. The arrest had shocked the community not because of spectacle, but because of recognition. The defendant had been a familiar presence, someone who stood in checkout lines and attended routine appointments without drawing attention. That ordinariness unsettled people more than any dramatic detail could have. Letters to the editor reflected a quiet reckoning with time, with how years can pass without clarity. There were no candlelight marches, no prolonged media cycles. The coverage faded as winter turned again, replaced by seasonal reports on traffic and weather. The legal process continued in predictable ways. An appeal was filed, citing evidentiary challenges and the reliability of forensic genealogy. Appellate judges reviewed the record, focusing on whether procedures had adhered to established law. Their opinion, issued months later, affirmed the conviction. It noted the careful safeguards employed and the corroboration beyond genetic evidence. With that decision, the case reached finality within the system. Notifications were sent to relevant agencies. The status in national databases was updated to reflect a solved homicide with a convicted offender. For the investigators who had inherited the file years after the discovery, the resolution prompted professional introspection. Many were approaching retirement, their careers marked by cases that never reached court. Emily Lawson's case became a point of reference in training sessions, cited not for its uniqueness, but for its patience. New detectives listened as supervisors emphasized the value of preserving evidence even when prospects seemed remote. The lesson was not framed as inspiration, but as instruction. Procedures exist because time changes what can be seen. The physical evidence was reviewed one final time before long-term storage decisions were made. Items not required for future proceedings were cataloged and retained according to policy. The sedan, which had been stored for years before being released to the family, was referenced in inventory logs, its role concluded. The trunk latch, once the focus of latent print analysis, was now simply an object with a documented history. The meticulous care given to these items underscored a principle understood by those who work cold cases. Evidence is not dramatic, it is patient. Emily Lawson's family navigated the aftermath privately. They declined interviews beyond their initial statement, choosing to mark holidays away from cameras. Court documents showed they attended sentencing, sitting together without outward display. Victim services records noted their request for minimal contact once proceedings ended. Their names appeared in the file only as necessary, a reminder that the case was never about notoriety. It was about a young woman whose routines had been ordinary, and whose death had interrupted a life, moving toward adulthood. The neighborhood near the wash had changed. By 2020, graded roads and utility lines traced the land where the sedan had once sat unnoticed overnight. Developers had consulted records to avoid disturbing the exact location, a small concession to history. A plaque was never installed. The place did not become a destination. It remained a stretch of ground with a documented past, known to a few and unremarkable to most. That anonymity suited the case's resolution, which had arrived without public ritual. Within the courthouse, the case left a quieter imprint. Clerks filed final judgments. Prosecutors updated internal databases. Judges moved on to dockets filled with newer matters. Yet the file's thickness and age set it apart on shelves, its spine bearing dates that span decades. Law clerks occasionally pulled it when researching forensic genealogy rulings, reading the opinion that affirmed its admissibility. In that way, the case contributed incrementally to the evolving framework of criminal law. The broader significance lay not in precedent alone, but in practice. The investigation demonstrated how incremental verification builds credibility. Each laboratory confirmation, each corroborating record, had been pursued not because it was dramatic, but because it was necessary. The absence of eyewitnesses had not been treated as an obstacle to be explained away. Instead, it was accepted as a condition requiring compensatory rigor. That approach resonated with seasoned professionals who understood that the passage of time does not lower standards. As years passed, the cold case unit continued its work, guided by similar discipline. Other files were reopened, some yielding results, others returning to storage. Emily Lawson's case was referenced occasionally, not as a guarantee, but as an example of what persistence could achieve when combined with lawful innovation. The caution exercised in her investigation influenced protocols, reinforcing the importance of legal review when adopting new methods. For the community, the case receded into a footnote of local history. It surfaced occasionally in conversations among longtime residents, usually around the holidays when memories tend to surface. The mention was brief, respectful, and factual. There was acknowledgement that justice, when it arrives late, still matters. The resolution did not erase the years of uncertainty, but it reframed them. In the end, the story of the Nevada 2000 cold case did not conclude with a dramatic revelation. It concluded with paperwork, signatures, and a closed file. The quiet aftermath reflected the nature of the work itself. A young woman named Emily Lawson had been identified, her death investigated with care, and her case resolved within the boundaries of law. The community absorbed the outcome and moved forward, carrying the knowledge that even in the stillness of desert winters, details can endure, waiting for the moment when method and time finally meet. The years following the final appellate decision passed without further legal movement, but the case continued to exist in quieter forms, embedded in records, procedures, and memory. For those who had worked it, the resolution carried a particular weight because it affirmed a belief long held among experienced investigators, that some cases are not solved by intensity, but by endurance. Emily Lawson's file was no longer active, yet it remained instructive, its chronology a map of how evidence behaves across decades when preserved with discipline. The cold case unit maintained the file as a reference, its margins marked not with speculation, but with confirmations earned slowly. In the courthouse archives, the paper trail told a complete story. Initial reports from December 2000 captured the stillness of that morning with professional restraint. Supplemental narratives added context without embellishment. Laboratory reports reflected the evolution of forensic science, each version superseding the last without erasing it. The final judgments were clipped neatly at the end, the language formal and conclusive. Together, the documents demonstrated how a system designed to move forward can also look back responsibly, correcting its own limitations through lawful means. For law enforcement leadership, the case influenced policy discussions about long-term evidence storage and periodic review. Budget requests cited Emily Lawson's case as an example of why climate control, digital conversion, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation mattered. The argument was practical rather than emotional. Evidence that survives intact preserves options. Options, when combined with new tools, preserve accountability. These principles shaped decisions that would affect investigations far beyond Henderson. The defendant began serving his sentence in a state facility far from the desert wash where the case began. Intake records described an unremarkable adjustment to incarceration. There were no public statements, no attempts to recast the narrative. The legal system's interaction with him concluded as designed, transitioning from adjudication to custody. His name faded from headlines quickly, replaced by others as news cycles turned. The absence of spectacle was consistent with the case itself, which had never relied on dramatic turns. Emily Lawson's name, however, remained present in subtler ways. Scholarship funds were established quietly in her memory at the community college she had attended, funded privately without press releases. Records show modest annual awards, renewed steadily. The gesture reflected continuity rather than closure. It acknowledged that while the legal process had concluded, the human dimensions extended forward. The holidays continued to arrive each year, carrying with them the quiet recognition of time past. In Henderson, winter mornings still brought frost to shaded roads, though development softened the edges of the desert. Maintenance workers followed routines not unlike those of December 2000, checking roads before sunrise. Few knew the history of the wash beyond zoning files. That anonymity underscored a central truth of the case, that significant events can occur in ordinary places, unnoticed until procedure gives them meaning. The land did not change to mark what had happened there. Only records did. Training materials produced by the department referenced the case in sections devoted to cold case methodology. Slides emphasized chain of custody, documentation, and the importance of reanalysis. The narrative avoided heroism. It focused instead on decisions that prevented error. New detectives learned that restraint is not an action, and that patience is an operational skill. The case served as a reminder that professionalism extends beyond the moment of discovery and into years of waiting. From a broader perspective, the case reflected shifts occurring nationwide. The cautious adoption of forensic genealogy illustrated how innovation could be integrated without compromising rights. Courts required transparency, investigators required corroboration, and laboratories required validation. Emily Lawson's case fit within that framework because it had been built carefully from the start. Early documentation allowed later methods to function properly. The lesson was clear. Future tools depend on past diligence. The local press occasionally referenced the case in anniversary pieces, noting its resolution among other long unsolved crimes. The tone remained factual. There were no interviews with investigators seeking recognition. The focus stayed on the process and the outcome. Readers were reminded that justice, while delayed, had arrived through lawful means. The articles closed without commentary, mirroring the case's own understated conclusion. As retirement ceremonies came and went, some of the detectives who had first worked the case left the department. Their exit interviews mentioned Emily Lawson's file as one they carried with them, not as a regret, but as a marker of unfinished business that time eventually completed. Others who had joined later spoke of inheriting the case as a responsibility rather than a burden. The continuity across personnel changes demonstrated the institutional memory required to sustain long investigations. In the final accounting, the case stood as an example of how a community and its institutions respond to loss without yielding to distortion. There were no shortcuts taken to satisfy impatience, no theories advanced without support. The work unfolded within the constraints of evidence and law, shaped by seasons that returned year after year. Thanksgiving passed, then Christmas Eve, then New Year's Day, each holiday marking another cycle in which the case waited for alignment between fact and capability. That alignment eventually occurred not through chance, but through accumulation. Each preserved fiber, each recorded print, each logged interview contributed incrementally. When the moment arrived to connect them, the structure held. The outcome did not depend on confession or coincidence. It depended on records that endured and on people willing to revisit them without altering their meaning. Emily Lawson's life, briefly outlined in reports and statements, was never reduced to statistics within the investigation. Her routines, her plans, and her presence were documented because they mattered to understanding what had been interrupted. The restraint shown in narrating her story reflected respect rather than distance. It allowed the facts to speak without overshadowing them. As the file settled permanently into the archives, its label marked it solved. That designation carried no ceremony. It signified only that the questions posed in December 2000 had been answered to the standard required by law. The quiet aftermath that followed was appropriate. Justice, in this case, did not announce itself loudly. It arrived through steady work, confirmed by review, and accepted without celebration. In the stillness of Nevada winters, when desert air turns sharp and mornings begin before light, the lesson of the case remains relevant. Details matter. Time does not erase them if they are preserved. Communities may change and technologies may advance, but the fundamental requirements of investigation endure. Emily Lawson's case closed without spectacle, leaving behind a record that affirmed those principles and a reminder that even the coldest cases can, eventually, be understood.